I made a terrible mistake. On the recommendation of a friend, Bridget Empire, I decided to watch Frieren Beyond Journey's End, and I'm afraid I loved it. I went into it a little skeptical, and her warning that it made her cry really made me hesitant because I'll ugly cry if I get started. Nonetheless, I watched it, it was good, and I wanted to make a video about how it drew me in despite my skepticism. What I'm saying is, if this video sucks, it's Bridget Empire's fault, and you definitely shouldn't subscribe to her on here or go to her Ko-fi to give her some money. Definitely don't do that. I'd be so owned if you did that. This video isn't going to be a review as such, but an examination of the ways it overcame two specific challenges in a particular episode. One, how to make you care about characters and relationships between them quickly when it's necessary to the themes you're trying to touch on. And two, how to immerse an audience in a world that's unfamiliar to them without looking at the camera and just telling people things too much. In order to examine this, we don't need to look at the series as a whole. We only need to look at the pilot episode because the heartache I felt watching it began almost immediately. Also, as if I need to warn you, but spoilers for the first episode of Frieren. I won't be talking about the manga since I've not read it yet. I'm planning to on my train to Spain because this has been recorded before my trip to Spain, and also because of how much I liked the show. And I won't really be talking about any episodes after the pilot beyond a bit of a description of the show as a whole thematically and mentioning those broad themes and maybe some clips in the background. So if you don't want to see that, there you go, you don't have to watch this. But honestly, go watch it if you can. It's really good, a solid 9 to 9.5 out of 10. Much better than Dune Part 2. Don't ask me why I felt the need to say that. I'm also not saying it's the only piece of media to do the things I'm going to talk about, but it did them well and it did get through to me, which is cool. The show itself is set in your typical fantasy setting, rolling fields, bustling cities, and impressive mountains. There's dungeons and dragons. Yeah, I'm gonna go there in a little bit, but if you've seen one fantasy anime or show, or God forbid read a fantasy novel, this is all familiar to you. It also takes the narrative structure you'd expect in this kind of setting. A party of adventurers go out into the world and there's a big grand objective, and like all great adventures, it's about the friends we make along the way, the side quests, and the ways they get sidetracked. The specifics of this are somewhat rolled into the way the show broke through to me, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. At its core, however, Frieren is a story about companionship, love, relationships, regrets, the impacts other people make on us even when we don't realize it, and how we reconcile this with the inevitable fact that we are mortal. Our main lens that we experience this through is the eponymous Frieren, who is an elf and therefore long-lived. Everyone she adventures with is almost certain to die long before her. That's a challenging thing to get people to invest in as quickly as the show got me to invest in its characters, a lot of whom we don't spend a lot of direct time with. Like, even though he's a vain bastard who we don't spend a lot of screen time with, I really like him or the hero, which is weird, right? And I think it's because of the structure of the show just allowing the character to breathe and at least feel sufficiently realized to have that impact. Also, we're just kind of primed to like heroes, which I guess is a benefit of his title being the hero. Just kind of how the cookie crumbles on that one, I'm afraid, folks. The lens of a long-lived character really tickled my brain because, as you may know, I run a D&D campaign. We have sessions every 2 weeks on a Thursday. It's always great fun. Come along. It's on this channel. A challenge I have as DM is how to understand and portray the motivations of someone who will outlive everyone in the interaction by some margin. Elves are like the entry level of this issue. It can escalate to deities. It's been known to happen in a D&D campaign, and trust me when I say, that is a whole thing. It's a challenge, and a lot of media doesn't grapple with it directly because we're on the adventure with the characters, and the focus of that media often isn't relationships and their impacts on the character, or if it is a significant subject, it's kind of a B plot that's glanced at. In fact, a lot of the time with elves, they're portrayed as a people whose time among other mortals is coming to an end, and it doesn't really go much further than that, and that's a rather typical fantasy trope. And I want to blame Tolkien for this, but also I got a C in GCSE English Literature, and my totally uneducated speculation is this is probably something drawn from folklore more generally. Of course, there are exceptions where elves are no longer long-lived, but were in the past. The elves of Dragon Age are a good example of that, and that opens up a whole set of potentially interesting narrative avenues to explore, but those aren't the ones Frieren is tackling. Elves in Frieren are exceptionally long-lived. I don't think they mention a maximum lifespan in the show, and unless you're a totally unfeeling being, which elves aren't depicted as, aloof, sure, but I'm struggling to think of a setting where they make absolutely no connections to other beings. This adds up, and you would think it takes an emotional toll. All of this would change how a character lives their life and how they make bonds with other people and places. Frieren spent a time period equivalent to the existence of the Ottoman Empire essentially on a career break. It's fascinating to me as someone who has to portray characters who have this fundamental difference in how they view life and time and all of that sort of thing. And that's a lot to do over the course of a show, never mind a first episode, which also has to overcome my personal dislike of pilot episodes. And I think this is a good opportunity to explain precisely why I think I don't like them. I'm not unique in that I'm sure other people barely remember the first episodes of shows they really like. Part of the reason why pilot episodes are by necessity weaker episodes is they have a specific set of tasks that they need to achieve, and it can be hard to balance all of them. For example, a show set in a different world or time period to the one we live in needs to situate us in that world or time period. This necessarily involves some exposition. Think of the Star Wars opening crawl, that scene in Obi-Wan's desert shack, the opening of the pilot of HBO's Rome, or the opening sequence of every episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm not one of those people who loses their mind whenever anything is explained explicitly in a story, but what it does is it occupies time. In a show where the important thing is the relationships between characters and establishing them, you need every second available to you, especially when what you're looking for is emotional investment. Basically, it's very hard and impressive when it's done well. Which brings me to the first episode of Frieren and how it does this in under 30 minutes, well, actually kind of under 14 minutes really, by looking at two parts of the episode separated by 50 years in the show's narrative. The first sequence I want to go through is the opening sequence of the pilot, set in the narrative past for us, the viewer. We have the heroes on a cart, heading back to the royal capital. It's made explicitly clear that this is the end of the adventure. The adventuring party has defeated the Demon King. Already we're seeing how the show makes effective use of its time. Even if you've never seen the show before, know nothing about the characters, or haven't read the manga, you probably recognize all of this. Even without the specifics, the broad strokes of this read as familiar. The adventuring party triumphantly returning is something that most people watching this will have seen before. Exposition can be as simple as, we defeated the Demon King, and a jab at Haita for being a corrupt priest, because we can fill in those gaps. We can assume that they've been on a big, meaningful adventure, because that's what we'd expect from the genre. Speaking of things we'd expect, maybe not if you DM for a D&D party like the one I have to deal with, is the heroes getting a big welcome upon their return, including from the king. The genius of this is precisely how unremarkable it all is. They're having their big celebration, and again, it tickles that D&D part of my brain, because it's very much the ending, especially if you as DM have made the fatal mistake of liking the player characters, you want them to have this ending. It's also the scene where we see the first real conversation the heroes party have with each other, which highlights the key thing that Frieren does in its use of these very typical elements of a fantasy story, especially at the end of an adventure. It trusts the audience to be able to use the information presented, and that we can infer from it to not need things spelled out for us in great detail. Meaning the focus can be on the actual substance of the character interactions. These are people who have traveled together for 10 years, and it feels like that in a believable way. They're comfortable expressing themselves, Himmel with his vanity, Heartache with his drunkenness, which, I totally don't relate to that, and if anyone tells you that I can relate to that, they are a liar and a fool. Their reflections on the end of their adventure doesn't need to explain great details about the world. In fact, we learn relatively little about a lot of the politics of the world as the series goes on, because it's not the point. It's a show that focuses on the characters, and this is a good way to set that tone. There's genuine warmth, affection, but one of the core themes rears its head. Frieren's status as a long-lived being manifests in that line. It was a mere 10-year adventure, which feels to us like a really out-of-pocket thing to say. Like, imagine a friend of yours says, we've only known each other for 10 years. To an elf who is functionally immortal, it makes sense, and it feeds into something the show does well, which is to have her express this alien attitude to life and time that her longevity causes her to have. Honestly, it feels a little cold, and it's put into perspective by this charming scene with the Era meteor shower, a once every 50-year event that really puts a fine accent on the era of peace that their adventure has supposedly ushered in. There's this charming and naive moment from Frieren where she suggests that the party get together in 50 years to go to a spot where you can see the meteor shower better than in a city, which I guess makes sense. Light pollution must be a problem. To which Himmel kind of just laughs, and it's really the first moment where you feel a tug in your heart, because it's so adorable that she thinks that 50 years is a guarantee for humans who are probably in their 30s, I would guess. The dwarf Eisen, who we've not really talked about much so far, is obviously a surer bet on that front, but you could feel the amusement of Himmel interacting with his very old but adorably naive friend's notion that 50 years is such a short time. Naturally, he accepts the offer, and the party takes in the glorious sight. Then the true end of the adventure comes, with everyone going their separate ways. Frieren is almost too casual about leaving the party. While this isn't the sequence that really brings out the emotions, it's a great setup for it. In around 6 minutes, we have a sense for the characters and can more or less fill out the kind of world that this is set in, because the show trusts us to do so as the audience. That trust is what allows so much characterization to be fit into those first 6 minutes, by signaling that this isn't an especially complicated or even very unique fantasy world. The show can focus on making these characters compelling to us, and each of the characters got to express at least a little of their own flair and show off their dynamic. I do think that there's something interesting here that points to one of the reasons why people feel there's a stagnation in some media, which is that there are worlds that are desperate to be known, and therefore the story is less about the characters and less about telling a good story, and more about feeding possibly interesting and possibly excellently constructed lore to you through the story. Not to lean too hard on this crutch, but I do think the original Star Wars trilogy is a good analogy here. Yes, it's clearly set in a vastly different world, and to be honest, we're comparing a science fantasy film to a fantasy anime, so our mileage may vary here, but it does a lot of the same things. Aside from that opening crawl, we're thrown right in. Now, Star Wars is different because it's not the aftermath of the big adventure TM, and it's a classic hero's journey. That being the case, it does trust its audience to pick up what it's putting down, which is lacking in some of the more recent output from that franchise. Topic for another day. But it's also what Frieren does. It allows us to fill in the space because even if we're wrong, it doesn't really matter and it's not really the central focus. The relationships are, and this is a great way to allow emphasis to be put there. In 6 minutes, we maybe don't realize that we care about the characters, but witnessing these interactions, their triumph, and yeah, like the gentle teasing some of us will do with our friends, makes us understand that yes, there are relationships that matter between these characters, whether the characters realize it or not, or are even capable of realizing it at this point, and that this will be the narrative focus going forward. After one of the show's characteristic montages to show the passage of time, we return 50 years later to the start of the real story that we're here to watch. Frieren returns to meet up with her party after the time has passed because it's time for the Era meteor shower again. We get our confirmation of just how much has changed. Emma was still alive, and it was odd because I felt this sense of relief that a character I'd barely seen was still alive, though to Frieren, who hasn't aged a day, Himmel looks extremely old. Mostly because he is, and also because he does look extremely old. Despite this, he still has some of that characteristic vanity, and you see the slightest smile on Frieren's face as they meet again. It's all exceptionally tender, especially when Himmel is returning the Shadow Dragon's horn that he's been keeping a hold of for his dear friend all these years. Maybe I'm weird, but as someone who has a lot of stuff that's been given to me by friends that I keep around, this is one of those things and one of those moments where I had to grab my chest a little. A good example is this. It is a champagne cork with a £1 coin in it that my friend's mum gave to me when we all graduated from university for good luck. I couldn't even use the coin in this anymore if I wanted, but I still keep it because it means something to me. A reminder of the adventures I had with those friends who I don't see as much as I used to. That really did resonate with me. Like, it's just a trinket, right? But I've given it value in the same way that Himmel gave the Shadow Dragon horn value. With a little bit of vanity out of the way, the party reassembles in full, and they immediately fall back into their comfortable roles within their group. This moment is one of those that feels familiar. I'm sure we've had friends who we've not spoken to for a long time, and then you just kind of pick up where you left off. Then there's this nostalgic walk with the party. An elderly Himmel narrates for us as they travel, and while it's a rather typical bit of old man reminisces, we do get that heavy line about Frieren always being there in the beautiful memories. As they watch the beautiful meteor shower, Himmel dies. We don't get told that. We just see the meteor shower fade to black and cut to the town being eerily silent, and then Himmel is laid in state. We experience his final moments through his eyes. It's an oddly warm, satisfying sensation. Even if we may understand what's happened to him, the funeral is one of the most gut-wrenching parts of the entire thing. Speculation about whether he was happy in the end, which given we saw his death from, again, his own eyes and heard his inner monologue, we can say with some certainty he was. Seeing so many people come out to pay their respect to him, and we're privy to the comments of one person who calls Frieren heartless for not looking sad, which you feel obligated to defend her when you see that. And it also causes her surviving teammates to intervene on her behalf, probably knowing what was coming from her later. It all comes to its climax with Frieren weeping and being comforted by her party mates as they bury Himmel. For this to happen basically 14 minutes into a show's actual narrative and have your heart broken by the line, "Why didn't I get to know him better?" and her friends comforting her, is an achievement. It's such a good way to show that for all her insistence that the time she spent with the party was a tiny fraction of her life, but it mattered, and that she matters to her friends. It's all achieved by these little details they sprinkle in because the show trusts you to pick it all up. Himmel's monologue, Frieren's muted but obvious reaction to how people spoke about her at the funeral, even the ring she holds in the scene after. The hint is there that this is something Himmel gave her, and look, spoilers ahead, but we do learn later that perhaps Himmel ascribed more weight to the item than her. But by now, given the references to human lifespans that have already happened, that's hardly a shock. The thing about it all is this is the part of the story we don't usually get to see. Usually with a fantasy story, we see the adventure where the Demon King or the Big Eye Tower or the Evil Emperor is defeated and everyone celebrates. The consequences reverberate a little and we just kind of leave the story there. Especially in fantasy, when we have stories where the characters' lifespans are often so radically different and their perspectives on life are necessarily different because of that, it feels a little awkward. Partially because I think we avoid thinking about it. Outliving other people, persisting in a world where everyone we love is doomed to die long before us, it's a heavy subject, and maybe it's because I recently had a loss in the family, but it hits you where you live. Again, the impressive aspect of this is the funeral scene is wrapped up by 14 minutes into the actual show. So to have me actually cry at least once 14 minutes into a show means something must have been going on. I think it's explained by the fact that yes, death is sad, obviously, but because these are characters who went on that type of adventure we're so familiar with, and that they were allowed to express themselves, not for very long, but for just long enough that it makes it feel like that it has that much more weight and that much more believability and realness to it. The characters as broad archetypes aren't that unique. Not enough that by this point in the story, the characterization is established enough for us to make those connections just from the archetypes. Frieren's secret is a lot like life. It's the little things. The vanity, the drunkenness, the taciturn nature, and the detached aspects of it all. The way the show made the decision that you don't need to be babied, but you do need to feel that these characters are familiar to each other, if not to you, was probably the right one. If you're doing a character-focused story, the best thing to do is to let your characters breathe, especially early on. I've said it probably too much on many different videos, but I don't like pilot episodes. They have to do things that are necessary, but aren't in and of themselves very entertaining. This episode is a good episode of the show. Is it the best one? No, I may have some thoughts on which one is the best, but we'll have to leave that for another day. My summary is this. This show can get through even the strongest emotional defenses, and I loved it. A solid 10 out of 10 show. I've bumped it up, actually, that I enjoyed and wanted to talk about, because I spent way too much time talking about things I don't like. So why not mix it up? Go watch it if you haven't already, and thanks for watching this video. I need to thank my proofreader, the excellent Bridget Empire. Go check out her channel. Presumably she has done some excellent video. I wouldn't know. I'm recording this well before this is going to be released, so surely she will have released something. And also check her out on the fortnightly D&D streams we do on this channel. And I also need to thank Molto, who made the thumbnail. I don't know how many different styles of anime I'm going to end up having her drawing me in, but it's probably going to be a lot. I also need to shout out the patrons and members, but before I do, remember, like, comment, subscribe. Tell me about what you thought about the show. I'd love to hear some back and forth on this, and just sort of see what people make of the take I had on this, because honestly, I just really liked the show, wanted to do a short thing about it. But with that, let's shout out the patrons, particularly the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kazushida, John N, and Liron. Absolute legends. If you want to vote on the topics of the videos, if you want to sort of get the shout out, if you want to get early access to all the videos, becoming a Patreon member over at patreon.com/SKTheCrusader, that is the way to do that. I also need to shout out the members: Nadejiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Scaly Bubble, Ben Johnson, and McGoggles. Excellent name there at the end, by the way. They also get pretty much the same benefits one-to-one. And if you prefer doing this sort of thing on YouTube and not on Patreon for whatever reason, then it's there for you. Go on, just go join it and you get the shout out regardless. But with that, everyone, thank you so much for listening to me talk about a show I enjoyed. I would really like it if I could do things like this more often. And yeah, I don't know if my friend's mum is going to watch this, but thank you so much for the for this. It definitely brought me some luck in the end, I think. Thank you very much.